Hi, everyone. Just that was a nice warm welcome. Let's do that again. Hi, everyone. That was way better. Cool. So I wanted to welcome you all to Rangle today. My name is Avery, and I work a part of the talent team. So today we're here to, the topic is Angular 2. We've done 20 plus projects here at Rangle to date, and we want to talk to you guys about what we've learned so far. I would like to introduce you to our two speakers tonight. We have Nick, who's founder and CEO of Rangle. We also have Yuri, who's our CTO at Rangle. So thank you again for joining us tonight, and I'd like to welcome Nick up to the stage.
Thanks everyone for coming. Tonight's a really exciting evening because Angular 2 was just finally released, and it was almost 2 years ago when it was announced that it was going to be substantially different from Angular 1, and so people have been waiting a very long time for it to be released, but at Rangle we didn't really wait that long. We switched over to Angular 2 semantics with Angular 1 projects almost a year and a half ago, and then when the beta hit last December, we figured, well, it's beta. I mean, it's going to release it in like a month or two, right? So probably January, February, latest March, mid-September. But they've done an amazing job. Angular 2 is a fantastic framework. It solves lots of issues that people discovered with Angular 1 as we built bigger and bigger large-scale applications. So Angular 2's out. Yuri's going to talk about it. It's very exciting. We're going to do a panel after as well, so we'll bring up some of our Angular 2 developers and architects, and you'll be able to ask any questions. So if you have any questions, please think about them. And you're watching Yuri's talk, think about any sort of questions you might have. We've been, even before Angular 2 was released, 50% of our work was on Angular 2. And so we've started most of our new projects with Angular 2, starting the beginning of the year. And overall, 50% Angular 2, about 25% Angular 1, 25% React as a project mix. So there's a lot of really great Angular 2 knowledge, and if people have other things that they can share from their own experiences, that would be great, because really the purpose of this meetup is Angular 2 and sort of thinking about it, strategizing about it, and learning what people need to know in moving forward with it. So with that, I will hand it off to Yuri.
Thank you. Can we? Awesome. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. I decided to call this talk Angular 2 a 1-year retrospective, and which may be a silly, funny title for it, given Angular 2 was finally just released a week ago. But the reason for this is because preparing this talk made me think about another talk that I gave in May last year. So this was a few months after in March we went to NGConf, March last year, not this March, and it sort of was very clear at that point that Angular 2 is now real, right? It wasn't yet close to necessarily being released, but it was clear enough of what Angular 2 is going to be, right? 6 months earlier, it was announced at NG Europe, but at that point, it was still a little bit unclear what exactly we're going to get. It was sort of defined a lot more by what's going to get removed, but by the March NGConf last year, it was becoming fairly clear what Angular 2 is going to look like, and it also became consequently a lot clearer of what we all need to do to prepare. So following that conference, we've really sunk our teeth into understanding Angular 2 and started thinking of how do we get ready for this. And so in May last year, I gave a talk here at AngularJS Meetup on preparing for Angular 2. Now that talk was kind of funny. The talk kind of got legs. It got a bit of got viewed fairly widely. And one of the things that was fairly funny about it is that when we went to Angular Connect in the following June, we discovered that the Angular team has watched that talk, which was sort of a little bit made me scared, obviously. But then Brad Green complimented and said, and I asked, he said, "Oh yeah, we watched your talk," and I said, "Well, what'd you think?" He said, "It was good. It wasn't insane." And we're like, yes, that's the standard that we aspire to fulfill, is not being insane. No, I mean, as I understand, this is because in comparison to every other talk that I guess they've watched on Angular 2 from outside the Angular team, having been insane. So so about a little over a year ago, we at Rangle started really switching all of our processes towards moving towards Angular 2, and then finally now, last week, Angular 2 2.0 finally is released. Right. So in the middle, this is a graph from June this year. I haven't had a chance to kind of do the same numbers, but I did a count in June last year about what our own developers were working on. This is the graph we got, right? So we had 52% of our staff here at Rangle.io working on Angular 2, with another 21% working on React and 27% working on Angular 1. I haven't had a chance to actually get the numbers for right now, but my guess is that they look probably a little bit more like that, because our work on Angular 1 has definitely shrunk quite a bit. Some of that shrinking came at the expense of, so it went towards React. A decent amount of it went towards expanding Angular 2. So this kind of all puts us into a little bit of a retrospective mood and saying that, well, we've been working on Angular 2 now for a year. Obviously, Angular 2 has changed a little bit over the course of this year, but in many things actually haven't changed. So consequently, I want to talk today about what did we end up getting in terms of Angular 2 yesterday, and talk a bit about what are some of the things that have actually kind of turned out the way we expected them to, and as well as some of the surprises, some of the things along that over the course of this year that actually kind of, we didn't necessarily expect that to happen. Now, how many of you have used Angular 2 for anything? Okay, so I'll try to kind of it's a little bit of a balancing act doing this talk, because obviously some of you have used Angular 2, the most of you have not really. Some of you would be new to the ideas that we've discussed a year ago. For some of you, you will feel like, oh, we've heard you guys talk about this again and again. So I'll try to do this talk in a way that's kind of will work for everyone. So let's start with some of the things that have turned out more or less mostly as expected. So I mean, it's like if you listened to our talk a year ago, you would sort of feel like, oh yeah, there's a little bit of deja vu. That's what we discussed then, and basically this is what Angular 2 ended up being. So of those things, the number one thing is components, right? I mean, if there's the one word that describes Angular 2, it's components, right? And the comparison in particular to Angular 1. It's really all about components. Now, the components in Angular 2, it's really, in many ways, not all that different from React. So if you are someone who have worked with Angular 1 and then didn't have the patience to wait for Angular 2 and have gone and started and became a React developer, that now is the time for you to maybe consider coming back, because you will find that that Angular 2 is actually very similar. It's inspired by many of the same ideas. It's very similar to React, but it actually brings that back to the Angular community. Now, components. Let's think about what that is and why is that important. So let's start with a bit of history. So in Angular 1. I mean, most of the people here, how many people here have used Angular 1 back in, how many people have used Angular 1? And how many people have used Angular 1 in 2013? Okay, so that's a good number. It's more people that have tried Angular 2 yet, right? So for those of us who were using Angular 1 in 2013, there was a sort of a classic approach to Angular 1, which basically means that you do a bunch of controllers and your controllers communicate through $scope, right? It seemed like a good idea at the time. I mean, for many people, it seemed like a good idea. I thought it was a good idea. When I first, I was like, that sounds cool, right? Because it allows you to build stuff really fast at first, right? It turns out to be a bit of a mess when you start building larger and larger applications, because you're basically building those pieces that all sort of communicate through the same structure, and then you kind of never know why your particular component is displaying stuff it's displaying because someone else modified something. So in what I would call myself late Angular 1, right, is you start moving away from that towards componentizing your controllers and directives, right? So you start moving towards controller as, which basically turns each of your components into a bit more of an enclosed thing. And you then start using directives. And then later down with like Angular 1.6, you start using component directives, right? And component directives allow you to do a lot of the things that Angular 2 allows you to do. it can be done well, but it requires a lot of discipline. And it also doesn't really give you much performance bonus for the hard work that you're doing. So with Angular 2, one of the things that we get is that we get performance bonus, and it also just basically keeps us on the straight and narrow path because it doesn't allow us to do things the ugly way. So now, meanwhile, as we're all sort of struggling to kind of stay honest doing doing more componentized development with controller as and whatnot, components become all the rage in React. And React sort of shows us a model of how to do applications that are really component-based, sort of all the way down in a very sort of straight and narrow way. And Angular 2, basically, similar to React, puts components at the center, right? So now, when I say components, what do you mean? Let's sort of do a quick exercise of thinking in components. So let's think of this example of a date picker. In a kind of Angular 1 world, you'll have this date picker that has access to $scope, and it kind of goes and, when it wants, modifies stuff on the scope, and then this affects a whole bunch of components up and down the list, and then somewhere else stuff gets displayed differently because your calendar happened to modify it. With the kind of component-oriented architecture, what you do is you really focus on inputs and outputs. You say, this component is going to strictly operate by receiving certain things and is input. It's no longer going to have access to any kind of global state. It's going to receive things as inputs. In this case, the inputs would be selected date and maybe some other options. And it's going to fire an event when something happens inside of the component, right? So you'll have, in this case, the output would be the selection of the date, right? And that's kind of all that really needs to happen, right? So this component, it's isolated. It doesn't have access to any $scope. It doesn't have access to any services. It strictly receives some inputs when it shows up, or those inputs can be set on it by the owner later. And when stuff happens in the component, it has a way of just firing events. Now, optionally, and it can also have internal state. But if it has this internal state, that state is transient, which is to say that when that component goes away, that its state goes away, right? So for instance, you could potentially, with a calendar component, say that the state would represent like which month are we looking at now, right? But then when you close it, if you reopen it, then you are kind of doing selection all over again. You're back to default month. So in Angular 2, when you are using a component like that, you would use the following. You would use it in a template like this, right? So you would basically, it's similar to a directive in Angular 1. You will specify the name of the component or the selector for that component, in this case, funky date picker. And then you will specify the values and expression that will set inputs on this component. And you will also subscribe to certain events coming out of the component. So in this particular case, we will say that the component is going to accept an input called selected date. And we are going to say that the selected date is going to just get set to a variable called selected date in our current template scope. And then when component emits an event called new date selected, we have a callback specified right there, which is that we're going to call onDateChange, where onDateChange is a function in our current available within our template. Now, the neat thing with Angular 2 is that there is this uniform model that really works across all components, right? So if you remember, with Angular 1, we have ng-click, and we have ng-whatever, and there's all of those little directives that basically handle special versions of that allow you to subscribe to events and that allow you to set certain things, right? ng-style, ng-click, whatnot. With Angular 2, it all gets simplified, where really there are inputs and there are outputs. And there is single syntax for setting values of inputs, which is brackets. So you put bracket on around selected date, means you are setting the value of that input. And there is the parenthesis syntax, so parenthesis around an event name basically means that you are subscribing to that output, right? I mean, this was very inconsistent in Angular 1. You had to kind of learn, 30 different directives. Here, there's really not, you just need to remember that there is brackets for setting a value, and there's parentheses for subscribing to an event coming out of component. Much, much simplified, and the neat thing also is that this works the same way for DOM elements, for built-in DOM elements, and for components specified in Angular, right? So if you want to subscribe to a click event on a button, you will have click in parentheses, and then you'll say equals, and you specify the function that you want to run. If you want to subscribe to the new date being selected on a more complex component, you do new date selected in parentheses, and then again you specify the function. Makes your life much, much simpler. Now, what does this all give us? Well, a few things. I mean, first of all, it gives us modularity, right? By modularity, I mean that you no longer end up spending a lot of time wondering how bugs in your component, which inevitably is going to have bugs, end up interacting with bugs throughout the rest of your application, right? And whether your component is displaying something because something else in your application is setting something on your scope, right? Or vice versa, right? Your component in this case is very simple. It's very isolated. It has inputs and it has outputs, which makes it very easy to understand. It makes it very easy to debug it. The second thing is code reuse, right? So once you have this component, that component is really independent of its context, so you can just sort of plop it anywhere. And that makes it a lot easier for you to kind of achieve uniform UI because you don't end up redoing the same code in different places. And finally, it's the ease of refactoring, right? So once you've got this component, you can be fairly brave about changing how this component works because you can be confident that changing this component, you are not going to screw up the rest of your application because your component has a very, very straightforward, simple interface to the rest of your application. You cannot introduce a bug that just goes and has some weird effect somewhere else in your application. So, and finally, is the opportunities for performance optimization. I'll talk a little bit about this, but if you do your components in a specific ways, if you basically limit yourself to certain things, then Angular can now optimize performance, and you can actually get fairly dramatic improvement in performance based on that. Now, thinking about components, one thing that is worth doing is really thinking about not just about components like date picker, but thinking of that it's components all the way down, like in that old joke about turtles. So when we're looking at a something like this date picker, we think of this as a component, but we also can then think, well, there's two pieces to that, right? There's a header, and then there is the actual month display, right? So we can think of the month display as a component. And then when we look at the month display, we can then look at every row within it as a component. And then we could then look at every cell within a component. If we sort of nest our components properly and really make them isolated, right? So we would think, okay, like our cell is going to have inputs and outputs. And it's not going to make a lot of assumptions about where it fits. It's going to really just have those inputs and outputs, and the larger component around it, the row, will pass it the information that it needs. Then it makes it a lot easier for us to construct other things out of the same smaller units and also to refactor them. So this is components, right? This is like by far the single biggest thing that Angular 2 offers you compared to Angular 1 is this component-oriented architecture, or rather support for components that really makes it easy for you to just stick with components and not stray off to the side. The second topic that we've talked about last year and that we've been talking about continuously, and you've probably heard me talk about this and everyone else at Rangle, is unidirectional data flow. Now, so in Angular 1, $scope is gone, right? Good riddance. Now, $scope seemed like a good idea to many people, myself included, when the first time I saw it. But it really has turned out that with the non-trivial applications, it's really difficult to work with applications that are based on $scope, right? It's for really simple applications, it was actually kind of seductive because it makes life so simple. But with the more complex applications, what this really means is that you have a single kind of global structure that kind of works as a read-write, different pieces of your application have read-write access to it. And every piece can modify what they want, and it makes it really hard to then figure out why is stuff happening. And on top of that, there were massive, massive performance problems related to $scope, as we've discovered once we started building bigger applications. So the second solution that a lot of us adopted soon once we've got sufficiently frustrated with $scope, and this is probably what a lot of you are using with your Angular 1 application, I mean, whoever is still working on Angular 1, is service-based state management, right? Where you basically say, put everything into services, right? I'm sure you've heard this. Again, we've been talking about this for like years at this point. Go and put all of your logic into services. Your services are singletons. They can store your state. Your components, or controllers, in case of Angular 1 and directives, can basically get services through dependency injection, and then they can get values that they need out of them, and they can set some values. Now, this is kind of a second best, right? This is, or second worst, I guess, depending on how you look at it, right? This is not as bad as $scope, but it's still pretty bad. The reason it's still pretty bad is because you've now divided it up, and you no longer have a global set of things that everyone can just go ahead and modify things. But still, whoever gets used, if your service operates effectively like as a read-write state, then you shared it now between a bunch of components, and different components go and set values on that service, and then other components either maybe pick up those values, or maybe they didn't even notice that the value changed, and you sort of kind of get this mess where different components have not actually picked up on the fact that the state have changed, or maybe they, you get a value display, changing in one of the components, but you're not sure why, and the reason is because there's another component that has access to the same service that's changing it. So it's less of a mess than with $scope, but still kind of a mess. Now, I'm not sure if I should describe it as good news or bad news, but that's still available in Angular 2, right? So that style of development, Angular 2 supports it. If you want to do that, you can. I would advise against it, but this is definitely possible. $scope is gone, but service-based state management is still an option in Angular 2. Now, what's better than that? Well, the better alternative to this is Flux. So the Flux architecture has developed, kind of became popular in the context of React. The React community tried a bunch of different approaches to Flux. There was many different Flux implementations. Around a year ago, last summer really, Redux came and sort of took the Flux community by the storm, and really over the last year, when people in React community has been talking about Flux, they usually have meant Redux, right? So Redux is a particular implementation of Flux that is amazing. We all love it. We've been using it on pretty much all of our projects over the past year. Now, when it comes to, so this is if you're doing React. So if you're doing React, Redux today is your solution. There's some interesting options coming up now with Relay, which basically allow you, which sort of link with things like GraphQL, but we're not going to talk about that since that's sort of more of a React world, though there are some similar solutions that are kind of seem to be up and coming for Angular 2. Now, if you want to use a Redux or Redux-like approach for Angular 2, and I recommend that you really do, you have two options. So one option is, we call it NG2 Redux. This is something that we've been actively involved with. And this involves basically just simply using Redux inside Angular 2, right? There's a fairly simple, Redux is a solution that is being most popular in React community. It requires a small bridge but it's independent of React. So there's a small bridge that a module that connects Redux to React. We have worked with with other partners on building a similar bridge for Angular, and so this is available as NG2 Redux, and basically it allows you to use Redux with Angular. We've been using it on a lot of projects and found that it works really well, and it allows you to tap into the whole Redux ecosystem. Now, the other solution that you should also consider is called NGRX. So NGRX is actually very, very similar in the sense that it's a re-implementation of the Redux pattern. It's similar sufficiently that when you look at NGRX code, it will take you a while to actually pick out the differences. It's a little bit more focused on RxJS, which a lot of people like because it aligns. RxJS tends to be used fairly heavily in Angular development those days, a lot more so than in React. So that's kind of a solution that, and it's also a solution that it appears the Angular team has, maybe not have so much as endorsed, but they're clearly paying a lot of attention to it because they're working closely with NGRX. So those are two options that you should consider, right? The difference between them really kind of depends on, do you want to actually go with a solution that's a little bit more customized for Angular? Do you want to go with a solution that's really focused on just sort of using vanilla Redux as it's used in React? But really, I would say, do yourself a favor and pick one of those. And because, whichever one you go, you get a Redux or Redux-like system, and it saves you tremendous amount of time and effort in terms of debugging your application, because what you then get is a system where your components emit actions, and they subscribe to changes in your store, and you really no longer have to deal with all of the mess that comes out of having a kind of a read-write access to the store where everyone can just go ahead and modify it. The third thing we've talked about last year and is ES6 and TypeScript. Right now, when we talked about, it's funny because last year it was actually not really clear what's going to happen in that space, because a lot of people weren't really using either. There were a lot of questions about transpilers, and in that sense, the most interesting thing is just how far we've gone as a community in that space, right? Like at this point, we've been using ES6 or TypeScript on all of our projects, and it's really amazing how a lot of problems that really kind of plagued us a year ago are gone. So at this point, I really would urge anyone to, whether or not you're using Angular 2, you should be learning ES6 or TypeScript. Now, in particular, Angular 2, you could use Angular 2 with ES5, right? But I'll repeat what I sort of said on this topic a year ago. You could use it in the same sense that you could drive a car without an engine by putting a horse in front of it, right? You could, right? I mean, you have a car, it has no engine, you plug a horse into it, and you whip it, and it goes. But it doesn't make any sense, right? The whole reason you're driving a car is so that you could actually use the engine, right? So half of your reason for using Angular 2 is so that you could actually really start taking proper advantage of ES6 and TypeScript. So seriously, learn them. Even if you are not planning on starting using Angular 2 immediately, start learning TypeScript today. The second thing is that last year, when we got started on this, there was a lot of uncertainty about what methods of transpiling and load modules, module loading would end up winning. We actually, at Rangle, spent a lot of time trying to get GSPM to work. A lot of people at the time felt that GSPM is going to be the future. At this point, it seems to me that the dust is sort of settling, and it's fairly clear that Webpack has won. We've been using Webpack on, I think, all of our projects, and I really, and finally, Webpack got integrated into Angular CLI, so we feel like at this point, Webpack is the future. So now, the other interesting question a year ago was TypeScript or Babel. At this point, it seems that it has settled very, very cleanly along community lines, where Angular uses TypeScript. Everyone who is working with Angular is using TypeScript. So consequently, if you're going to be doing Angular development, use TypeScript. React community is using Babel. If you're doing React development, use Babel. Like it's like, in a sense, it's really that simple. I don't think at this point it's worth arguing which one is better. If you're working on Angular 2, you should be using TypeScript. Your life is going to be much easier because you're in the ecosystem that is very much TypeScript oriented. And last thing I want to note is that one of the really neat things of TypeScript that kind of wasn't there in ES6 is decorators. And it's conveniently, decorators are actually now coming to ES6, but that's one of the cool features from my perspective of TypeScript that really actually cleans up a lot of code in Angular. And one of our guys here, Michael Bennett, he is somewhere around. He did an awesome talk at ngConf on demystifying decorators that I would sort of recommend everyone Google and watch, because decorators in TypeScript are something that looks kind of magical, but they really are just functions, and it's not actually that hard to understand how to write them, how they work, and then you could start writing your own decorators, and that's kind of cool. So, to wrap all of this together, let me give you an example of a component, of how a component works, and just so you get a taste of what writing Angular 2 involves. So I guess the first thing that would jump at you with this code is that this is ES6 or TypeScript. I mean, that's another thing that wasn't, I guess, clear a year ago. Clear a year ago, ES6 and TypeScript wasn't, there were sort of things that were part of ES6 that weren't in TypeScript and vice versa. At this point, ES6 is strictly, TypeScript is strictly a superset of ES6, so you get all of ES6 within TypeScript. So this is ES6/TypeScript code. We start with a proper import statement, so we no longer need to kind of use the modules that we were using with Angular 1. We now can do proper modules, ES6 modules. Our component itself is implemented as a class here at the bottom. In that sense, it's actually not that different from using $service in Angular, except that it's implemented as a class. Now, you could actually, if you were using TypeScript before, that you could actually use implement your services or controllers as classes, right? The controller as could be implemented as class. In this case, however, it's an ES6/TypeScript class, and I've mentioned that components have inputs and outputs. So what we have here is both inputs and outputs are defined as TypeScript private variables, right? So we have here on this line count specified as a number. With TypeScript, we get typing, and we have result, right? So those are two types. So this is count is our input, and result is our output. In this case, count is just a simple value. So the owner of this component will be able to just go ahead and set the value of count. And the result, in this case, is an event emitter. So basically, the owner of this component will be able to subscribe to a stream of events. So every time the output updates, the counter value updates, we're going to actually have an event passing through that stream, and then the owner of this component can subscribe to it. Now, we identify, and this is where the decorators are pretty awesome. So in order to tell Angular that those are inputs and outputs, we use decorators, right? So we have here @input decorator, and here we have an @output decorator. And this is how Angular knows that @input is to be exposed to the templates that are going to actually be able to access that component, and that @output, that the result is something that we can subscribe to. Again, within our templates, we can assign a callback to it. And then finally, we do a method here. It's a simple component. It has no state, but there is one method, increment. And here what we do is we just basically, every time increment is, a method is fired, we're just going to go ahead and increment the count and emit the new value of the count through our output. Now, we are also here, and this is where things are a little different from, I mean, this piece at the bottom is actually fairly similar to React if you've worked with React. The piece at the top is a little different, and actually more similar to how things work with Angular 1, where we provide a selector. So this is the name under which this component is going to be available in templates. And we also provide the template for that component. The template for this component is actually, you will see a lot of similarities with Angular 1, right? There's the same sort of double curly brackets to incorporate the value of count. And then we also see the methods for subscribing to inputs and outputs that I mentioned before. So in this case, we want to include a button component. Now notice, we know that button is not an Angular component. The button is an actual button, but they use the same way, which is very convenient. So in this case, we're going to include a button, and we want to subscribe to the click of that button. And again, so we're not going for ng-click or anything of that sort. We say that since the button has a click event, we subscribe to that click event by putting click in parentheses. And then we specify that when the button is clicked, our response to that event is to call the increment method of this component. So as a result, when we do that, the increment method is going to get fired. As a result of that, the count is going to get incremented, and this new updated value is going to get pushed onto the stream. So whoever is using that counter component can then subscribe to result, and every time a new value appears, they will receive that event. The other thing, so this is a kind of a fairly basic component, but I am not going to get in tons of detail with it, but I wanted to add just one interesting piece of complication, because that is what kind of gives you a lot of efficiency, a performance efficiency with Angular 2. which is the different update strategies. So, or the change detection strategies. So the idea is that once you put your components in a tree, right, the way it works in Angular 1 is they're watchers, right? Like you basically have the digest cycle, and the digest cycle, you're trying to figure out what changed, and every time something changes, you go and check what else changed, and this ends up being very, very ineffective. Now, in Angular 2, if you just put your components together, you could potentially end up with the same situation because you have your component, and that component is provided a value from the parent. And then if that value is an object, that what if something changes inside of that object? So if your component is sort of forced to go and check that object and see if stuff changed inside of it, then that kind of brings you back to where you keep checking stuff all the time. The nice thing is that Angular gives you a number of change detection strategies, which is basically you can tell at the level of your component, how is this component to react to different changes, right? And your changes can be very aggressive, where you basically say, yeah, I kind of do want to be checking stuff all the time, which are relatively inefficient. But your component can also say that, you know what, I'm going to make a deal with my parents that they're going to give me information in certain bursts, and I'm going to chill in between. Right, so in this case, we are setting, so this is an extra change detection parameter inside of our decorator. And we're going to specify the change detection strategy as being on push, which basically means that if we're not going to actually watch for changes inside of the object, we are going to only update when the entire object is replaced, right? Now, this requires a certain amount of discipline now or foresight at least, on the part of your owner of that component, but it gives you massive, massive benefits in performance. So the idea is that if you are clever about change detection strategies that you use with Angular 2, you could save the render tons and tons of time. So those are things that are might have been a little bit of a deja vu if you watched our talk about a year ago. Now let me talk briefly about a few surprises. So the one fun surprise for us was we got contacted by Angular team in August last year, and they said, do you guys want to work with us on Angular 2 development tools? And we're like, yeah, that sounds fun. So since then, we started working on that just around this time last year. This was our first Angular 2 project for us. So because this is written in Angular 2, we announced this at NGConf. This is one of our developers, Vanessa Yuan, speaking at NGConf. This was pretty stellar, and I'm not going to talk too much about it because we've done a talk at this meetup before about this, but it's fun. I have stickers for Augury if any of you want them. Come and pick up a sticker and go and install it. The second item that was sort of a bit of a surprise, or kind of a fun surprise, was native script, right? So as you might know, summer last year, one of the big excitements in the React community was React Native, right? And React Native is an amazing proposition because it sort of allows you to, we were using, a lot of us were using Cordova before, and Cordova allows us to basically write JavaScript applications that run on the browser as applications. They use container like WebView, which is great, and you can make it performant and you can make it look smooth and whatnot. It takes a bit of effort, right? It takes a bit of effort because ultimately you are kind of running a little browser inside of your app. And so a lot of people were looking for this really true, like, butter smooth experience with Cordova, and was a little bit of a challenge to achieve. React Native brought this proposition that you are actually going to be scripting in JavaScript real native components, right? They're not sort of, there's no web view, they're actual native UI elements, and you script them with JavaScript. Which is kind of amazing because you basically do get that butter smooth experience, and at the same time you are writing your application entirely in JavaScript, and there's no DOM to worry about. So now, little known, even though Angular team has announced this fairly broadly a while back, but it seems like never got picked up, you could use React Native with Angular 2. But I guess no one does because, well, it's called React Native, and we're talking about Angular 2. So conveniently, a different solution came up. It's actually very similar. It makes the same value proposition, and it's called NativeScript, right? So NativeScript basically allows you to do with Angular the same thing that React Native allows you to do with React. It's the same idea. It's native components that you drive them through JavaScript, and in case of NativeScript, they have put a lot of extra effort to really integrate this with Angular, right? So it's a kind of, at this point, a very Angular friendly. I mean, if you were to use React Native with Angular, you would need to do a bit of hacking. If you want to use NativeScript, then it's there for you. They've done the Angular integration for you. And we actually had an opportunity to do a demo for NGConf for one of the for Kiva. They're a nonprofit, and so this was kind of a chance for us to work fairly early on the NativeScript app, and it worked quite well. I mean, it really does give you that sort of experience, that you native-like experience while working on a JavaScript app. And we've had a chance since to work on another NativeScript project, and think that this is going to be very exciting in this coming year. More fun stuff. Angular Universal, a way of running Angular in the browser. This wasn't really quite on our radar quite as much a year ago, but this is now a reality, which is really important, obviously, if you're trying to do SEO. Angular CLI, just sort of right around the corner. We feel like that's going to make really a big difference to Angular development when that really sort of hits its prime. And finally, I guess the biggest surprise for me this year was getting kissed from Shai Reznik at NGConf. So now, a few words before we wrap up. A few words on CSS. Now, and CSS may seem like, wait, why are we talking about CSS now, right? Like, we're talking about Angular 2. Well, we've discovered over the past year, and this was maybe a little bit of a surprise, that, well, CSS, Angular 2 kind of requires you to rethink your CSS strategy a little bit. Right around the time when I was sort of standing there and talking about how awesome Angular 2 was, we were in the middle of our somewhat brief love affair with BEM. I mean, BEM is the block element modifier syntax for CSS. It's basically a way of organizing your CSS in a way that's sort of very modular and component oriented, right? And it's kind of awesome. If you're building like a massive website, right, where it's like your website has like this much HTML, and then instead of having your CSS be kind of a giant mess, you could organize your CSS with BEM, and then your CSS is very, you have done sort of like your kind of component thinking for your CSS, and your CSS is now all sort of modularized and easy to understand. And this is kind of awesome. Or if you're doing like giant Angular templates instead of giant website, right? Now, as you start working with components and you start breaking up your components smaller and smaller, and your really code is now organized as a bunch of small components, we found that the BEM approach kind of starts getting a little awkward, because you now have built this two parallel hierarchies of components, right? This is your BEM hierarchy, and then your actual Angular components or React components, and hopefully they align, because if they don't actually match, then it kind of becomes really weird and hard to understand. So one solution to this that that has become fairly popular is direct styling, right? So this is very popular today with in React world, and it's available today. It can be fairly effectively done in Angular with ng-style. Right? So the idea there is that you basically say, you know what, before all of these calculations that we were doing probably in Sass or less, we're just not going to do that at all. We're just going to put all of our styling, we're not going to have CSS, basically. Right? We're just going to go ahead and put all of our styling into JavaScript. Right? And this approach is, I mean, it's extremely popular today with React, and this is also there's a way of doing the same thing with Angular, where basically you calculate your values, right? So the sort of calculation that you would have done in Sass before, you now do that in JavaScript, right? And then for your component, you set your styles, right? You just say, for this component, here's going to be the font size, and here's going to be the color, right? And now the nice thing about this is that you no longer have those two hierarchies where you kind of have to switch back and forth between your CSS and your JavaScript. You kind of have it all in one place. It does mean that your people who are working on CSS, your designers, need to learn JavaScript, but it's not necessarily super complicated. You don't need to get into the ugly details of your services or whatnot. So this was actually a fairly decent solution, but the challenge is that when you do your direct calculation of things like font sizes and colors in your components, you want, let's say you're using a color, right? So you want to make sure that that color you use for that component kind of corresponds to the color you use for some other components, right? Let's say you decided that there's going to be a certain shade of purple that you're going to use in many parts of your application. There's certain buttons that are going to be purple, there's certain sliders that are going to be purple, and you want to make sure that it's the same shade of purple, and unless you specifically want it to be different, right? So which means that now you don't want to be kind of putting like the actual hex values when you style your component. You want to be pulling them out of, say, constants, and now suddenly you kind of end up with a bit more of a complicated setup with your CSS, right? Where your designers, they need to go ahead and hunt down where you set all of your constants, and it kind of becomes a bit of a mess. So the solution that we actually ended up settling for the most part is microclasses. And microclasses and Bash CSS. Right? So the approach here is, I would say it's an approach that's, when I first encountered it, struck me as a little bit odd. But once you kind of wrap your mind separately about CSS and separately about inline styling, you're like, oh, this actually kind of does give you the best of both worlds. So the idea is that you specify a bunch of non-semantic, small non-semantic classes, which basically apply kind of a little bit of a package of styling. So for instance, you say that for your colors, you specify a style, you have a class that specifies a particular color that you want to be using throughout your application. So let's say if you want to your application to be using 5 colors, right? You probably don't want to be using tons of colors in your application. Let's say you want to be switching between 4 or 5 colors within your application. You give each one of those colors a name, which may not necessarily even be a color name, but some sort of name. And then you apply within your inline styling inside of your component, you go ahead and you actually apply that class, right? So let's say that if your buttons generally alternate, like you say, your UI elements generally switch between being red and being black, you define your shade of red, you define your shade of black, you have those 2 colors in your component, you go ahead and specify that on active state this is going to be red, on inactive state that's going to be black, and then this gives you actually a decent amount of flexibility where you're not making the fine-grained decisions in your inline styling, but at the same time you do no longer have sort of massive, large BEM-like structures, and instead you do a lot of most of your decision-making in your components. So this was CSS. In that sense, there's a little bit of a different approach that we found that you need to use, and this is the same approach that we actually use both with Angular and with React. So now let's talk quickly about getting started with Angular 2. So let's quickly talk about Greenfield. So, I mean, first of all, Greenfield Angular 2 is really easy, right? I mean, we've brought, as I mentioned, most of our developers are now learning Angular 2. We've been finding that we can get people onboarded to Angular 2 very quickly. It's really not that complicated to learn, and you can get very effective very fast. Now, the first thing that you probably want to do as you start moving towards Angular 2 is learn ES6 and TypeScript. Again, I said you could, in theory, use Angular 2 without ES6 and TypeScript, but really spare yourself pain, don't. Learn ES6 and TypeScript because that's a huge chunk of value you get from switching anyway. The second one is understand the component model, because the component model, and we have blog posts about it, we have more talks on this, but the component model is really the crux of it, right? And this is something that today you would use regardless of whether you're using Angular or React. You want to be, component model is where the value comes when switching to Angular 2. The third is adopt Redux or NGRX. Again, whichever one you do, just pick one of them. Compared to service sort of based state management, both of them give you massive improvement in architecture, and both of them are very straightforward in the sense that you don't need to make tons of complicated decisions. Like a lot of the difficult decisions are made for you. Third is use our book. So one of the funny things that happened over the course of the year is as we were working on training, and we do training, we're developing handouts for our training, and we've sort of incidentally wrote a book. And then we've incidentally, so we decided, oh, let's put it online, and then we discovered that our book is basically one of the top 2 Angular books, which is kind of funny. So seriously, this is how we onboard all of the people who join Rangle. This is how we onboard them, is that we just like go read the book. So I recommend this to everyone. Now, if you don't want to remember the URL, just Google Angular 2 book. We are the second unsponsored link. We're still working on being the first, but for now we're the second. The NG book 2 is still above us slightly. And just while we're at it, we also offer training and consulting, just saying. And finally, give Augury a try. I mean, this is a tool that we've invested a lot of effort in. It gives you great ability to look into your Angular application and kind of understand what's going on, so give it a try. Now, let me talk quickly now about moving from Angular 1 to Angular 2. Now, if you're switching if you want to have a large code base, and you're going to move that code base from Angular 1 to Angular 2, it's obviously a little bit more challenging than just doing Angular 2 from scratch. And I would sort of recommend that you probably want to try at least a simple application in just Angular 2 kind of in a greenfield mode before you attempt a migration. But when you're working on migration, I guess the first thing to remember is that your first step is kind of refactor your application towards better Angular 1, right? Because there's a lot of Angular 1 code there that really, I mean, Angular 2 imposes certain constraints on you. A lot of Angular 1 code there really doesn't live by those constraints. Consequently, the difficulty of taking code and migrating it from Angular 1 to Angular 2 really depends on what kind of Angular 1 code we're talking about. There's Angular 1 code out there that's just gonna need to be rewritten, but there's also Angular 1 code that actually can be moved to Angular 2 very trivially. We talked a bit over the past year of how to write Angular 2 in Angular 1 in such a way that it would be easier to migrate to Angular 2. But basically, I mean, ultimately it means that use component directives, switch to upgrade your code to Angular 1.6, use component directives, switch to more of a component model, move the code that doesn't need to be in components into services, take whatever code that you can make it stateless. All of those things will make it a lot easier for you to later take that code and move it into Angular 2 context. The third thing is that start using ES6, right? Again, if for your project you're not ready to switch to Angular 2 now, well, at least start using ES6 and TypeScript, because this is a big chunk of learning that you need to do, and you could actually learn all of that now while still working with Angular 2, getting immediate benefits. And there is absolutely no downside of using when you're using Angular 1, there's no downside to doing that with ES6 or TypeScript. So I would recommend that. The fourth thing is adopt Redux. We're actually kind of looking into what it would take to make NGRX work with Angular 1, but Redux we've been using with Angular 1 for a long, long time. And again, even if you later want to switch to using NGRX, switching to using Redux with your Angular 1 application will take you a long, long way towards that architecture, so your transition later would be a lot easier. Now, step 2 is actually trying Angular 2, right? So there, what you would want to do is you would want to start writing your Angular 2 components, and then you would want to integrate them using ng-upgrade, which basically allows you to run Angular 1 and Angular 2 together. Generally speaking, it's a little easier to go bottom up, so basically integrate Angular 2 components into your Angular 1 application rather than the other way around. The reason it's easier is because you could put Angular 1 components inside of Angular 2, but they need to then, with ng-upgrade again, but they need to satisfy very narrow criteria. And by the time you refactor them to really fit them, you might as well just convert them to Angular 2 because they're basically going to be Angular 2 components. So because of that, the bottom-up approach might be a little bit easier. So next step is we're going to have a Q&A with Rangle developers after a short break. Hello, so I'm the CTO of Rangle.io. I guess you heard me speak earlier today. Or should I be using just a microphone? I have my own mic. So I'm the CTO of Rangle.io. I've been with Rangle.io pretty much from the beginning, and have sort of, as we've moved from Angular 1 to early Angular 1, late Angular 1, now Angular 2, and I'll probably take the more kind of businessy questions that the audience might have. And I have here with me 5 of our developers who have all worked with Angular 2 now for quite a while. Each one of them have at least a month of Angular experience. Some of them have been doing for pretty much a year. So they're going to be able to also provide maybe more depth on the technical questions.
Hello, my name is John. So I joined Rango a year and a half ago. I worked on 2 pretty big projects over the time, building stuff that's pretty enterprisey with lots of components. The first one is Angular 1, and then the second one, which I'm currently working on, is Angular 2. Started in March, so I've been working with Angular 2 since the beta days.
Since the beta days means like for more than a week.
So hi, my name is David. I've been working on Rangle for a year now. I started working with Angular 2 since December. I was actually involved creating the training book that Yuri told before. And I've been working mainly 2 applications with Angular 2. There was a big application I've been working since January. And that application actually started when Angular 2 was alpha. So I watched a lot of changes to the framework during that time. Right now I'm in the support squad, so it's mean I'm doing a lot of training on not only Angular, but other tools like Webpack, for example. So that's pretty much what I'm doing.
Hi, my name's Chris. I've actually worked with John on the last 2 projects, so we've been working together for almost a year and a half. I've actually been working with Angular 2 since February. So it's been, 8 months, 9 months, something around there. Started on, I think, beta 13 maybe. So I've done everything all the way up to the release. I just finished upgrading our code base up to release from RC4. So that was interesting. Yeah, so if you have any questions about upgrading your Angular version, or lately was doing like dynamic component loading, which has been interesting because it's changed every single version, give me a shout. Okay, thanks.
Hi, Michael Bennett. I'm working as a developer at Rangle for just about a year now. Been working with Angular 2 since December, and I've been primarily involved with the book, training, and writing some Angular 2 applications here and there, plus hacking on it in my free time.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I started December last year at Rangle, and I've been basically working with enterprise projects as well. Working in a big enterprise project for a company that works with transportation. So that's basically about it. It's a very heavily form-oriented application. So yeah, that's it.
Sure. Sorry, my question is, you had one of the slides where you were going into the calendar, and you showed how you could break it down further into smaller and smaller components. So I guess my question is, how do you identify what's the right size of what's the right chunk for a component? Like, how far do you break it down?
So in the theoretical answer is go as far as you can, but maybe some people here could provide actually kind of a more practical real world answer of where would you stop?
Well, I can get that. So basically, in this project, we have been very granular. Like every label, we have a label component. We have input component. So we have like the core components that basically wraps HTML tags so that we can use those immutable styles like base CSS. And then you reuse this component for your app. And when you want to change something, like you want to change the standard for your padding or something, so you have a core component that's used everywhere, you just change that component, it's going to reflect everywhere. So like that was the basically reason of why we decided to break it down in very small components. I don't know how you guys have been doing this, but.
Okay. Yeah, so for us, it's basically the same idea because we want to componentize everything. And the motivation behind that is so that like everything can be consistent. So I think we've gone as far as like his similar to his thing, but we have like a heading and then we have a label. So for example, we want to show someone's email, we say email and whatever the email is. So then this sort of style or format is used all over the app. And in order to keep like the paddings consistent, the styling, the colors, the text, the font consistent, we actually made that into its own component. It takes two parameters, the heading and the label and the value. So it can go down as granular as that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So my questions are about AOT, or ahead of time compilation, which was introduced, I guess, since RC5. So do you currently have any any app, any Angular 2 app with AOT enabled in production? How hard did you find it to implement AOT? And how much of a performance gain did you get from, how much of a first render improvement and file size improvement did you get?
Yeah, I don't think we have an application in production with AOT right now. We've been trying to experiment with AOT and tree shaking, mostly through Webpack. We have faced some issues with AOT right now. The gains for file size, for example, if you apply tree shaking, your application is going to be 1/3 of the size. If you apply AOT on top of that, you can get maybe 70% more of improvement of the file size. But the most important improvement is that you get rid of the compiler itself, so you don't have to ship that to the browser. In that sense, the browser doesn't have to do compilation, so it's going to be much faster and easier to just render everything at once. So it's going to be like a smaller startup time now.
Okay, thank you.
Hey guys, how do you maintain the consistency across your code base for Angular 2? Maybe even the same team, or if you have some guidelines across the whole organization. And also, like, did you come up with good practices for Angular 2 as well? And do you use maybe like some linting tools? Like, you know, I used ESLint for Angular 1 or Node.js projects. How do you maintain the consistency across your code base so then it's readable, you know, like a few years down the road?
Okay, so we're talking about consistency here and making a maintainable code base that's easy for everybody to read in Angular 2, and will hopefully maintain that ease of readability. So we put a lot of thought into this, actually, and so have a lot of other people too, which is great. So as a base, we tend to defer to the standard AngularJSTO style guide that John Papa made. And we do that because it makes a lot of sense in most cases, and also because then it's just easy. We're going to be dealing with lots of apps that have been built by the community. They're probably going to get their insights from Angular.io. It's just going to be easy for all of us to communicate. So we use that as a starting point. And we also have some of our own conventions, too. So we adopted Redux, what was it, about a year ago, I think you said, Yuri? And just enabling something like Redux or NGRX and that kind of a single central store pattern in your code, suddenly things become considerably more consistent. So you can jump from project to project. You just look in your reducers folder and you know exactly how your state maps. That alone makes things really easy to think about and deal with. Myself personally, and a lot of other Wranglers here too, we really like to keep our functions small, pure, and not componentized in the sense of a UI component, but componentized in the sense of an actual reusable, consumable function. So we put a lot of thought into that kind of thing. Now, with respect to linting, which you also asked about, we use a relatively rigid set of TS-lint configurations. You can get those in our starter packs. They're not too dissimilar from the prescribed ones that you'd get with the Angular CLI. And those go a long way to sort of forcing our code to form a mold. And automatically, once you're on one of those, you just know what to look for. You see, oh, there's a comma missing. Things just don't look right. So that starts to jump out at you. And of course, unit tests. Like unit tests, not necessarily for the value of, you know, they give you this sort of confidence that your things are going to work properly, but there's also a deeper value in that they force you to write things in a simple fashion. And by forcing yourself to write things in a simple fashion that's easy to test, theoretically it's easier for you to read later, and I found that to be deeply true. I don't know if anybody has anything else to add to that.
Yeah, if you see if you can read the test, I think it sometimes tells more about what is being tested than actually if you read the description of the function or even like the code itself. And what about like project structure itself? Because I find that JavaScript is kind of Wild West when it comes to structuring big projects. I'm not talking about like to-do list, I'm talking about like enterprise, large scale, and you know, like again, it comes down to maintainability. But would you be willing to share the project structure that you use for more like enterprise-oriented systems?
I can talk to this if you want. We have a project with, I think, 240 components. So it's quite large. So at first, we tried to take the approach where every component's not tied to a page. You just try to structure it based on that component. We found that over time didn't really scale well, and things are like at a certain point page-oriented. So we have like a sections folder underneath our components folder, and that's like per page kind of thing. So like an accounts page or like a contacts page or whatever, and then those keep kind of getting nested further. And then we also have like a common folder as a child sibling with our sections folder, where all of our commonalities go. So we have like grid functionality in there. We have all of our inputs in there, and we have basically like calendar things and stuff like that. And then I think we have like a bunch of other folders. We have like a services folder, a helpers folder, which takes kind of the same structure as our components folder, where it breaks into the commonalities and then like anything specific, like actions, reducers. I found that scaled pretty well. Like if you need to find a certain component, you just what page is it on, or if you know it's like a reusable component, it's just in the common somewhere. So I don't know.
I think it will be very appreciated in the community, and like generally amazing if you could GitHub like a template for Angular 2 project that would be scalable like that. So thank you very much.
I believe we actually have a Angular 2 starter with Redux.
That's a good point.
And we share it, it's public. Anyone can use it. I don't know if you want.
No, that's a very good point. So we have, we do the same thing for Angular and also for React. We have, when we start, because one of the challenges that we have is that when we have a new client, we want to really get moving very fast and show the client that we have something, you know, going for them. And in order for that, to do that, what we've done is we've invested quite a bit into starter projects, right? So the idea is that you get a project and it sort of has everything that you need so that you could actually be productive in your first hour as opposed to your first day. So we have, and all of that stuff is on GitHub. So we have an Angular starter project on GitHub, and we also have a React starter there. And we actually have a few variations on some of those. Like we have an Angular Redux, and we have a few other ones.
Right, we have one without Redux. I actually grabbed the microphone because I wanted to talk about something else. So I want to talk a little bit about process. And you spoke about how people got on the same page and how people sort of collaborate on the project. So we sort of have a process where if we want to commit in code, we create pull requests. And it depends on the different projects, but we have other team members look at our code requests that were just pull requests that we're just about to commit in. And this is not to say that like one person has a power over another and decide what code goes in. It's meant to start a conversation to get the developers to kind of get together onto the same page. So that when the code goes in, everyone knows what's going on, and this structure there's nothing unexpected about it. And if there is, then people can know ahead of time and not when they're actually going into the component and say, what is this, right?
And actually, let me add to this. So this is at the project level, right? And obviously, the project level consistency is very important, right? And in that sense, pull requests go a really long way towards moving towards that consistency, right? Because you no longer have just individual people just writing their own code and pushing it. We also, in our case, the consistency between projects is not quite as important because the different projects we do are for different clients. Sometimes they actually need to adapt to the client's pattern. I mean, if the client uses a certain style, then it makes sense for us to stick with that style, but we still want to have cross-pollination between projects. So the other thing that we do is we have cross-project code reviews. Now, they're done a little bit differently where within a project, the idea is that really, let's say, if John and Chris are working on the same project, then John makes a pull request. This pull request is not going to get merged until Chris have reviewed it, and this way the two of them stay in sync. And this is really happens literally, like this is the only way that stuff gets merged in. Right? We're very serious about it. Now, between projects, obviously, you cannot do it at quite the same level of granularity because someone else works on another client project. Their time commitment to, say, John and Chris's project is very limited. But what we still do is we kind of make sure that every project has someone from outside who is working on another project, who has a look at their project occasionally and kind of provides feedback. And this is meant to be a two-way street, right? Where so there's an external reviewer for that project. They will look at the code, and sometimes they'll be like, what? We are handling this a little bit differently on ours, and sometimes they will be like, whoa, you guys are doing this, that's kind of a cool way to do it. We should start doing this on our project, right? And this is sort of another way for us to make sure that there is cross-pollination between projects and ensure a certain degree of consistency between different client projects that we're working on.
Can I add one more thing to this? We found that interfacing so TypeScript has something called interfaces, which coming from a JavaScript background and going into TypeScript, I was very afraid at first. I was like, oh no, we're going to type everything. It's going to turn into C# and Java. They're like, I prefer JavaScript. This is going to ruin my life. But slowly over time, I realized that, just because you're writing functional code and it's like, you have your inputs and your outputs, doesn't mean that doesn't play well with like typing too, because everything is technically in a structure, whether or not. So we ended up creating like, oh my, geez, we had like 70 different interfaces, and we just create interfaces for everything that is like more complex than like a simple array or simple object, and we just type the crap out of everything, because then you know what's coming in out of a function, what's coming out. If someone's creating another sort function, then it's like, oh, I should use the sort interface as like the parameters, or I know how to like make my reducer the same as that other reducer for like this other data structure because it's the same thing. So we found that provides a lot of consistency within our application.
Great. Thank you very much.
Oh, hi. My name is Justin, and my question is regarding the upgrade of the project along the evolving of Angular 2 APIs. Because myself, I started to look into Angular 2 probably mid or early this year, but even within these few months, like the API has evolved a lot. So, because you guys said you are doing Angular 2 project like 1.5 year already. So just wondering, how do you guys manage kind of migrating the Angular APIs along, especially for real production projects? And usually, how much cost do we see in that for like a really consulting project?
Okay, so we might both do this. So we just had a question, and it was about how do you deal with the changing the APIs, Angular 2's APIs, and how they evolve. So they've evolved considerably. In the alpha days, it was quite wild. So we had a project, actually, at least one, maybe more, that started back in the alpha days. And pretty much all of our projects that were in the early days, and even the later ones, the general strategy is sort of you get to a milestone release, something. So like the most recent milestone was, say, RC6. Well, RC5 is almost the same as RC6, so they're pretty similar, but the gap between RC4 and 5 was pretty big. And the gap between, say, one of the last betas, I think it was 17 or so, and RC1 was pretty big. So you sort of get to that stage and you have a stopping point. And in between those sort of intermediary branches, it's kind of like Angular 1.1 to 1.2, so not too huge, or a 1.3 to 1.4, but every once in a while you get that 1.2 to 1.3 sort of jump, and that's, you sort of save up for those and try and schedule them ahead. And I think in most cases, though, outside of the jump to the first RC, you're looking at a cost of a day to 3, depending on the size of your project, and depending on what path you followed. So projects that don't follow the so-called narrow path, like if you focused on the core set of features, you just built out components, you kept things simple, your life was a lot easier. If you were doing fancy things and going off the sort of straight and narrow path, then your life got a lot more difficult, and the cost would definitely be higher than the 1 to 3 days I just estimated. But a lot of our projects tended, I think, for the most part, to stay on the narrow path, with a few exceptions that maybe Chris wants to talk to you.
For the most part, we found, at least on our projects, the upgrades were pretty minor. As you said, like 1 between 3 days. I think the upgrade to RC5 was the most annoying one. Had to go and remove the directives and providers from every single component over our 250 components. So that was more just manual labor than anything, you know. And I think one of our coworkers is pretty good with Sublime, and he helped me do a nice little find search, like copy all the paths and then paste them all, and like we edited every line. So we ended up doing like 300 components in the span of like 30 minutes for like adding them into our index file. So that wasn't too bad. I think one of the biggest pain points was like dynamically loading components. Like we had the dynamic component loader, which is like used for like models. So if you're gonna do like a model factory, so you can like make things on the fly. So that was using dynamic component loader at first, and then that got deprecated, and that we were using component resolver after that, but then that got deprecated. And then after that, we had components factory resolver, and then there wasn't really anything on the web that showed you how to pass data into your dynamically loaded components. So sometimes the APIs were a little sparse, and you had to go hunting. I found TypeScript was good for that, because you can sometimes just match the types. You're like, okay, well, this input parameter is taking this, and I know that comes from this, so I'm just going to like inject this in here and just see what happens, and that kind of worked. So if you stuck to the main feature set, I think it was good. That was the only problem we had, other than like maybe changing ng form control to form control, and then the control to form control. It was just a lot of like renaming, which was like kind of annoying, but it wasn't anything other than tedious. It wasn't like really mind-boggling or anything. Oh, hold on.
There was actually one thing was problematic when you sorry. It's like most of the changes are very simple changes, as Chris said, among like many different files. But after you update it and people start testing and using, and then you start finding misbehaviors in few pages and components. And for example, when Angular recreated the forms, it didn't change much, it's just more renaming. It actually changed the order that your control was getting the value set. So the event output that was fired before the value was set. So all your code base in all your components, all your containers, they just start getting null or undefined. So like there's pinpoints like that too that was kind of painful. But then you change everything and you put a comment saying Angular changed, and then next version they fixed it, and then you undo everything you do.
Okay, hopefully, like as they said in the release meetup, probably at least they keep 6 months, no change, like breaking changes for the final version. Okay, thank you.
They said that they're going to try to not do breaking changes from now on.
It's only every 6 months.
Only every.
Yes, only every 6 months.
Hey guys, I have a question. So right now we're writing an app with Angular 1 and Angular 2 in the same ecosystem. I'm wondering what kind of problems, or if you've done that, or if you just scrap the whole Angular 1 and then make it Angular 2, how do you go about really making those two systems live together? Or if you do those type of things. I don't know.
Right after I joined Rangle, I basically was experimenting with upgrade and like bootstrapping both Angular 1 and 2 at the same time. So I really don't know how upgrade is at this point, but at that point it was working for like few things you had to change.
Right.
But most of the experiments I did was good Angular 1 projects. So like I really don't know. I know you guys have any like experience on that, but it worked. But it was kind of hard to make them communicate well between each other, especially routing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. Right now I'm dealing with those type of situations, so I'm just wondering if you've gone down those roads or how you've combated them, or you've just totally said, "Hey, everything's going to take 3 days, and let's just make it all Angular 2." I don't know how you've gone about that.
Yeah, like initially there was NG4. I think they got rid of it. I think so. I don't know if you've ever seen NG4, but it's basically they provide like a way that you can change your Angular 1 components, so they would be using decorators and a few other things, so that when you want to jump into Angular 2, it would be easier to refactor them. But I think they got rid of NG for it, and the upgraded have been through a few changes.
Yeah.
I think it's hard because Angular changed a lot, so many breaking changes in the core. So like, how can keep the upgrade compatible with Angular 1 if the core itself is kind of changing?
Yep.
But yeah, I really don't know how it is at this point.
So you should suggest take the 3 days or 4 days and just kind of
I would suggest
upgrade
if you can really bootstrap both applications,
Yep.
you go through your core and dump its component so that you can start changing things that doesn't depend on other things.
Right.
So like if you have components that can inject services,
Yep.
that's kind of hard because you have to upgrade the services as well, otherwise your component's not going to work.
Yeah.
So if you start taking down like small components and pages that has less dependencies, that will make your life easier. At least was what I've noticed when I work with it.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Julia. I have 2 questions about Redux. First question about Redux. How you guys decide from state management what should go to Redux and what state can be encapsulated and keep inside of the component? The second question about NGRedux2. I see the value compared to GNRX to use NGRedux2 to have the whole Redux infrastructure behind Redux. It's like reselect, func, and logger, hot reloading. I have experience with NGRedux with Angular 1, but I didn't play with NG2 Redux. So are you able to use these tools like from React community in Angular 2 with NGRedux2?
Yeah, for sure. I think you should, for the first question, I think, like at least my opinion, like if you can put something on the state, you should do it. Like every single thing, even if it's just a Boolean flag that's gonna change something on your state, it should be on Redux. And I think we use like reselect with ng2 Redux, sending it as your selector so you can compute values from the state. That worked really fine. I think last upgrade, people were getting issues that you were dispatching actions and doing like side effects, async actions, and then store gets updated, your subscription it's called, everything it's in theory working, but Angular wasn't rendering the components. So like some problem with the cycle, but I think they got rid of that at this point. Yeah, so I think almost all libraries from the Redux ecosystem, you can basically use it with the connectors. It's basically fine. So,
So the question is, can you use hot reload with Angular 2? And to the best of my knowledge, no, you can't yet. That's one of the things that's kind of React specific, unfortunately. And by hot reload, you're talking about the hot module reloader, is that correct? Yes, I don't think we can actually do that yet. We're hoping one day, but we haven't got there yet, unfortunately.
Hi, my question is related to the dynamic component loader and all the iterations that I went through. So the way to do it after RC6 is to create a dummy directive, put that on the component, get that to compile, and then you can inject something into that component using the component resolver factory. What is the standard approach that you would use to create a nested sort of way to keep loading dynamically?
Nested is in like you load a component in, and then that component
that
loads
component needs to load another component, and so on.
Interesting.
After RC6.
Where's all the like the data coming from? To, like what needs to be loaded into like each child? So like, can you give me an example?
Okay, so assume you have a widget container, and then that widget container needs to load a widget into that, and the widget needs to load something else.
So, but
yeah.
Where is like the dependency for each widget? Is it configurable, or like, do you know what I mean? Like if you have a widget containing a widget.
Split into modules, so each widget is its own module.
Oh, module loading?
Yep.
Okay, I haven't done module loading yet. I've seen that you can do dynamic module loading. I've just done dynamic component loading. Have you done? Wait, I think Yes.
I don't know if you mean lazy loading modules. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
That's possible. I mean, you can define your routes. You can define which of the modules you want to be lazy loaded. So only when the user is navigating to that particular path or route, that module is going to be loaded, and you're going to get it from the server. So in that case, you only need to be mindful that it's going to be creating, Angular is going to create a different node in the dependency injection tree. So if you do it the wrong way, you can get duplicated instance of services. So you have to be mindful when to use for child or for root to be able to inject only one instance of services to have a singleton in your whole application. But other than that, it works well.
So you haven't tried doing like nested component loading, like dynamically, or?
You're able to define shared modules that you can use in your lazy loaded module, and then you have access to those components in the shared module. So that's possible. From there, you can just use any component inside components of different modules. The only requirement is just to define that in the import property of the ng module declarator. That's the only thing.
Thank you.
Hi. I would like to know about your thoughts about Ionic and Ionic 2. Have you experimented a lot with around it? What are Ionic 1 had lots of performance issues. What are your thoughts on? Just to get a few ideas.
Anyone on this panel?
No?
Yeah, I think we are missing our. We have worked on Ionic. We have done tons of Ionic 1 projects, and we've worked on Ionic 2. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone on this panel that really has a lot of experience. So I
Next
think
time.
that next time, exactly.
Thank you.
So I don't know Ionic. I don't know if it's related to what I'm going to ask, but did you have experiences exporting Angular 2 apps to native mobile apps using PhoneGap, Cordova, or something like this?
The short answer is definitely.
Sorry?
I'm saying the short answer is absolutely. So we
Okay.
definitely have done Angular 2 apps as mobile apps.
So good results? No, I mean, no, exporting to native mobile apps.
You mean using Cordova or something?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Okay.
we've done tons of Cordova projects. Now, obviously, in the recent months, a lot of excitement now is with either React Native or NativeScript, right? So that's kind of where. But we've also been working quite a bit. So I mean, we've worked historically a lot with Cordova, and we've done some projects
Okay.
with Cordova recently with Angular 2.
Okay, good results there. Okay, because I'm about to try, so okay. Another question is, so we're talking here Angular 2, excellent. In the market, do you see people looking for developers like full stack developers working on the back end too? Or do you see very, I would say, specialized market for developers that want to be, okay, I want to be specialized on the front end and some other people specialized on the back end? How do you see this in the market?
I can speak for what we look for, right?
Okay. So what do you
I
look
have done
for
a
in
lot
the
of
market?
going around and applying for jobs recently, but what we look for is really first and foremost people who it's a kind of we look for a combination of two things, right? We look for kind of solid understanding of software development, in particular in the context of larger projects. And also, we look for understanding of JavaScript, right? Now, this has been changing over the last few years, but a few years ago, when we started Rangle, right, 3 years ago, there weren't a lot of people out there who would have had experience building complex applications on the front end, right? So 3 years ago, my kind of go-to profile was that the ideal person would be someone who has worked on the back end before and has switched to JavaScript a couple of years ago, right? Now this was because I mean, if you're look at 2013, you're looking at candidates. I mean, chances are no one has really done anything humongous on the front end. This changes now. So in that sense, today there are candidates who really have whose most of their career has been on the front end, but they've done some amazing things on the front end. we still like to see back-end experience also, right? Because I mean, the main part there is that if you're a better front-end experience if you worked on the back-end, you're a better back-end experience if you worked on the front, because you just kind of understand the concerns from the other side. But we still, I mean, when we hire, we don't really sort of get hung up as to, does this person know Angular? Does this person know Node? Does this person know React specifically, right? Because you can learn all of those. I mean, if you understand how software works and you understand how JavaScript works, then you could learn the specific frameworks.
Right. Great, thank you.
But what other companies look for, I know, maybe our guys here have been applying for jobs recently and can tell you.
I can speak just from like a LinkedIn perspective. I constantly get emails all the time, just, oh, you know Angular and you know JavaScript, please come work for our company. And I get maybe like 1 to 2 of these a day. So, I mean, I don't know if that speaks to what your question is, but if you know, like, I just put React on my profile, and then all of a sudden I started getting bombarded by like React jobs, and you know, I'm sure Angular 2 is going to start hitting the market like that. So it's a good time to be a front-end developer, and I think a lot of companies are looking for front-end developers. In terms of like skill sets, as Yuri said, it's very beneficial to know how the back-end works. But in terms of like actual job description, like if you just want to do front-end web development, it's super easy to find a job right now. There's like so many.
Thank you.
Yeah, just sorry, to expand on that a little bit. I remember when I first started, probably 8-9 years ago. Like, if people want to do front-end, there is no such thing as front-end developers. Everyone looks for full-stack developers, and that's because we're building web pages with JSPs and like PHPs and Java applets, Flash, whatever, right? But basically, what the front-end is just HTML spit out by the backend to be rendered by the browser. So everyone looks for, well, there's no such thing as front-end developers. But now there's a much more better divide because we started using protocols to communicate between the front-end and back-end, like REST, like to some extent SOAP. And so we can sort of separate the two and make them separate systems. So nowadays, it's much more prevalent to have your back-end guys separate from the front-end guys.
Yeah, my question was more driven because I see some people, especially on the back end, very resistant on, okay, I code back end and that's it, right? Period. So, but when I see like folks more front end off, so they say, no, I give it a try and move back and forth, or it doesn't matter. But yeah, that's what I was curious more about it.
Well, I mean, so people who have been working on back end and they've been sort of saying like, oh, I don't want to try anything else. I mean, well, those are obviously not the most attractive candidates, right? So I'm not going to go and say, please, 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 please come work on the front. And they're like, no. No, on the flip side, people who have been making that transition, we really try to meet them halfway, right? So I mean, we really kind of we go out of our way looking for people who have lots of back-end experience, who have decided that they want to move to the front end, and we apply sort of different standards for it. I mean, so if someone sort of applies and I've been working on back-end for 10 years, and I started learning JavaScript 3 years ago, but I really, really want to be a JavaScript developer now. Obviously, I'm not going to ask them the same questions about JavaScript that I would ask a developer who's been working with JavaScript for 5 years. I mean, the expectations are a little different, right? We will then have a lot more of a conversation about them, about their backend experience, not necessarily because at this point I was like, well, I want to assess their really sort of standing as a software developer, really more than just a JavaScript developer, because I understand that they are a novice as a JavaScript developer, but they have all of that backend experience that I mean, obviously they need to be willing to do that, right? But we are going to help them do that. And we've actually have a number of people working with us who have we've brought in at that point and who've made that transition very, very successfully.
Okay, one more question. As far as performance goes, comparing Angular 1 and Angular 2, what do you think is the best advantage of Angular 2? In terms of performance?
On-push change detection.
Sorry?
On-push change detection. So you can actually kind of segregate parts of your app and be like, don't look into this area until the input parameters change. Just don't do it. So it's really good for things like really giant grids. Like we have some grids in our app that are like just way too big, and our entire app is like really slowing down because it still goes through the entire trees and looks at everything. And if we were typing and it could barely type because it was like checking so many nodes, especially like on IE Chrome, it was like fine, but IE 10 it was like pretty laggy. So we threw on push change detection, and it like solved all of our problems. So I think having that accessibility in Angular 2, just kind of like as a don't touch this area until like I tell you to, is like super beneficial for sure.
Cool. Thanks.
The best improvement is that you no longer have the digest cycle. So before your templates needs to be checked constantly, and even Angular didn't know when they're going to be stable, if at any point. So you used to see that error that you get too many cycles and it's going to break. So in Angular 2, even the default change detection strategy is just going to check your components just once, and it's going to go through the tree of components. So you're never going to have that problem to be a template or an application inconsistent, right?
So for me, there's probably two things that I really like about Angular 2 for performance that haven't been said yet. And one is the divorce from the DOM. So they've very cleanly separated things. It's a lot harder to accidentally introduce memory leaks unless you get on your element ref or start doing things like that. So that's a big deal for me. And then the other is, it's only tangentially related to performance, but it's just the amount of effort they've put into making the system statically analyzable. And I'm just happy that's there because it means I might be able to apply tools like the AOT and crank out more performance that way and get the computer to sort of do my work for me in that respect.
Great, thanks.
Hi. Yuri mentioned earlier about native script, and you highlighted some of the benefits of it. Did you, I guess you worked on some project with it, right? Mm-hmm. Did you run into any issues where you said, we were able to do this with Cordova before, why we're not able to do it now? Or like, did you find any downsides to do it? Let's put it this way.
So it's a very, did any of you guys work with native script? No? Okay. So it's a very different approach, right? I mean, it's sort of similar to React Native. It's a very different approach to Cordova, right? In a sense, with Cordova, really, ultimately, you're doing web development. You're just doing web development that packages things differently, right? And in that sense, I mean, you sort of get all pros and cons of web development. With things like native script, or for that matter, React Native, it's actually a lot, in sense, it's a lot closer to native development, right? Because it's almost maybe a little bit more reasonable to compare it with native development, because the main thing is that you are really working with native components, right? So there's no DOM, there's no HTML. I mean, all of that stuff is gone, right? So it does require you thinking a little bit differently, right? So I think, from what I understand, by talking to developers who've really spent time working on this, a bit of an adjustment is just simply learning so in a way, the transition is very simple for people who have done work on native work, right? So if you've done, say, iOS work, and you know what components iOS provides you with, then it's very simple, because then you're like, oh, it's like programming native iOS except for in JavaScript. Now, if you are if you're transitioning from web, the challenge is that, well, you know how DOM works, right? The DOM works in its own quirky ways, but you know how it works, right? The native components may work in a much more sane way in many ways, but if you haven't worked with native, then this may be a little bit new to you. So there's a little bit of a learning curve from that perspective. It's also a little bit of a different strategy in terms of how you optimize things. So, I mean, the reason, like when Facebook came up with that in the first place was I guess, React Native, the logic really was that they wanted to really native-like performance, right? So, or native-like experience. So in that sense, your approach would end up being a little different. So with Cordova, you kind of prioritize consistency between platforms, or you prioritize multi-platform development in a way over native-like development. You basically start from the beginning, you have something that works on all platforms, and it sort of in the first version, it may be a little janky, and then you start saying, okay, well, now I'm going to actually make it work better, I'm going to sort of work on it until it really feels native on all platforms. With NativeScript, you kind of approach it from the other end, right? You're basically saying that let's make this work really well on iOS, right? Like it's almost like, right? And you build your iOS application, right? And then you really get the exact sort of same result, which looks just like an iOS application. And then you say, well, now let's make it look on Android, right? And so when you start making it look on Android, at that point, your whole even design approach is a little different. Because I mean, if you're building a native application for, like, let's imagine you just like have two teams. You have an Android team and iOS team. In that mode, they're actually not going to build the same application. I mean, the companies that kind of do native development, they build two different applications for two different markets because they kind of know that iOS users expect certain things. Android users expect different things, and you sort of end up with two applications and with two different code bases, right? So with the kind of NativeScript, or for that matter, React Native approach, you sort of do a little bit more of it's two different applications, where your target for code reuse is a little bit lower. You get to reuse, let's say if you're using something like Redux, then like that whole layer is reusable between your applications, right? But when it comes to components, your components actually may be different. You may be using different components between iOS application and your Android application, and you probably should choose to make them look a little differently because they really, right? So that the approach in that sense is very different. So comparing them feels a little bit like comparing apples to oranges. I think comparison to native is a much more proper comparison.
Do you feel you lose some of the control over design? Because I just briefly looked over while like on the break. It sounds like you're basically, instead of styling it, right? We use some template here. You're basically saying, I want a list and if it's material, it's material.
You lose control of a design if you're in a web development mode, right? If you want it to look like a web application, then you will feel that you lose control of a design, right? But that's what I'm saying. Like, you kind of need to approach from native perspective. I mean, like, people who do native development of iOS don't usually feel that they lose control of a design, right? They are designing applications for a platform, and they're going with what that platform offers, which makes it really easy for them to build applications that feel native and natural on that platform, and they don't usually feel like, oh my God, I wish I was doing web development, right? So it's the same thing. You kind of need to approach it from the perspective of a little bit separately for each platform.
Thank you.
Last question.
Yeah, hi. How do I decide whether to use Angular 2 or React Redux when starting a new project?
You guys have fun?
Depends on the client and their needs, I guess.
I mean, are there any parameters to consider, like which is faster? Is React faster than Angular 2 or something like that?
So I've put a lot of thought actually into thinking about, Angular 2 versus React and all that kind of stuff. And to the point Yuri was making about the native code earlier, they end up really being a lot like apples and oranges when you really get familiar with both of them in some respects. And so when you're looking at Angular 2, you're looking at, if you're doing a massive application, it's awesome for that. If you're in a big enterprise, it's awesome for that. If you don't know every in and out of the broader JavaScript ecosystem, Angular 2 is awesome for that. It brings all of these things to the table. React's also awesome if you like to have control over every little choice you're going to make. And not everybody has that luxury to take the time to make all those choices. In terms of performance, in my own side projects, I've seen Angular 2 surpass React, but it has the luxury of being newer, and it also has the luxury of it being, well, the Google team's second major iteration, and they rewrote Angular 2 about 5 different times to try and make it perform. Like, if you dig into the source, you'll see it's really built to last. Like, they've abstracted everything out. They've made it just really, really well engineered from that respect. So I think we're going to see it around for quite some time, and I think even as it ages, we're going to see it age quite gracefully. At least that's my hope. React, on the other hand, I love it, but I'm actually wondering if it's going to age quite as well, and that's just speculation. I don't know the future, but we'll see. I mean, it'll be exciting to see what Facebook's second offering is going to be when they get around to it too, and it's just great that we have all these tools. So that's what I think about when I think about starting an Angular 2 or React project. Anybody else? Okay.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
I think that's a great answer.
I'm just going to talk a little. I haven't really worked with React on a production level, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experience with Angular 2. The thing with Angular 2 is that it provides you with sort of like a framework. It has predefined expectations of where everything will go, especially with Redux, right? So it already expects you to save data into a store, or like it has services to call REST APIs with that React doesn't really provide you out of the box. So then you sort of have to like, it comes out of your head, right? So for me, I feel that like, Angular 2 applications, if I look at another Angular 2 applications, I know that it's going to look sort of the same, and it's going to be faster to read for me. So it provides structure, but at the cost of flexibility.
One thing that I would also note is that our approach really has been to have our developers ideally be familiar with both, right? Because I think, so the two frameworks, they're actually, there's many differences, but there's also, at this point, a fairly substantial conceptual overlap between them. And in many ways, I think that being familiar with React makes you a good Angular 2 developer and vice versa. So I would actually kind of advise people at this point to really try both, right? And it's like you don't, as a developer, you don't need to decide and just say, well, I'm just going to go and learn Angular 2 and I'm going to, learn both, try both. And I think, either way, you'll be a stronger developer in one, but for having actually tried the other.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.